I'm Ann Simmons, reporting from the newsroom of the Los Angeles Times. As President Obama prepares to take his case for military strikes in Syria to the American people, both the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and the rebels who oppose him appear to be actively gearing up for such an assault. The Times' Beirut bureau chief, Patrick McDonnell, has been covering the crisis in Syria and recently visited that country. He joins me today to discuss what he has learned as the countdown begins on America's possible intervention in Syria. Welcome, Patrick.
My pleasure, Ann.
Patrick, tell us first of all, there's been some recent developments. I understand the UN has actually proposed that the Syrian government be given some time to give up its chemical weapons. What do we know?
Well, today, Monday, was a day of very, very fast-moving developments in the Syria crisis, which began in London when Secretary of State John Kerry basically challenged the Assad government in Syria to turn over its chemical stocks within a week, which I think was possibly a throwaway line. We don't really know, but the Russians took up on it and asked the Syrians if they would do that, have an international body take control of its chemical weapons, and the Syrians appear to have agreed, and the UN Secretary General appears to be behind the proposal. So the ball is somewhat in the court of the United States now, because basically there's this whole new proposal that seems to have Russia being a close ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, Russian and Syrian and UN backing for the Syrians to essentially destroy its chemical stocks.
Now, even though Assad has been given this possible opportunity to give up his chemical stocks, is the Syrian regime still preparing for some kind of assault?
Well, there's no question that all sides in Syria are preparing. The government has been reported to be emptying potential targets, command centers, barracks, headquarters, emptying those of personnel, spreading its troops around, spreading its weapons around. Some of the rebel factions are reported to be getting ready to pounce if indeed there are substantial American attacks. So everything in Syria, both sides in the conflict are kind of waiting and preparing for the eventuality of a U.S. missile strike.
And what needs to happen, Patrick, in order for U.S. strikes to be successful?
Well, it depends to some extent on what one defines as successful. If one defines success as substantially degrading the Syrian military capability and tipping the balance in the civil war, one would imagine they would have to be quite substantial and quite strong. I covered the Libya conflict, in which we had 6 or 7 months of airstrikes by the U.S. and its Western allies, and it took that long to degrade Colonel Gaddafi's military, which is much, much less strong than Bashar al-Assad's military. So it depends on the definition of success. If it's just a message, well, maybe a message could be a few days. So it depends on, ultimately, and there's been conflicting reports from Washington about what exactly they do want, but it eventually depends on what they want to accomplish.
And tell us this, Patrick, I understand that you recently visited Syria. What was it like in the towns that you were allowed to visit? How are people reacting? How are they coping with everyday life?
Well, I mean, Syria is a very sad and rather forlorn place right now, depending on where one goes to. The center of Damascus, believe it or not, life goes on pretty normally. Most of the battle is in the suburbs, and I was able to visit several of the embattled suburbs, and they are war zones, and they're 10 minutes from Damascus, and it's just there's destroyed buildings, snipers. It's very dangerous, but there's this it's kind of odd, because in the middle of Damascus, life can go on pretty normally, and one can imagine one is not in a war zone, except that one always hears mortars and bombardments. I've also visited several other cities, Homs, which is north of Damascus, which is very heavily hit by the war, and that's a city where many neighborhoods have been completely reduced to rubble, and there's a real sense of a war going on and of a city almost being occupied. Then there's places like Tartus on the Mediterranean coast that don't seem to have been touched by the war at all, except for the fact that many people have been killed, soldiers fighting for the government of Syria.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for your insight today. We'll definitely be continuing to follow this story.
My pleasure, Ann.
For more on this and other stories, please visit latimes.com.